Following my usual practice of letting review material go by unrecorded, I'd evidently turned the tape on in the middle of the speech. It's not easy to summarize what I felt on hearing what she had to say. She put it all together at last. I had no idea what the talk was officially called. I knew it could only be called The Great Remembering. This was it, the fulfillment of the promise, and it left me with only about 1,000,000 questions. But there was one thing I finally understood beyond a shadow of a doubt, and that was why both Charles and Sheeran declined to formulate a defense against the charge of being the Antichrist. I was disappointed in myself that I'd been so dense about it, that I'd failed to hear what they were telling me, and what Father Lufer was telling me. At any rate, I finally understood why, when I said that B seemed harmless, Father Lufer's reply was, "That can't be right." Indeed, it wasn't right. I've made a copy of the speech. In these uncertain circumstances, no precautions are excessive. Obviously, Father Lufer didn't turn up here tonight, or if he did, he's been asleep for hours. 3 a.m. I finally figured out why I can't get to sleep. I'm going to have to learn to think more like a fugitive. I'm too used to being passive and trusting. It took me 2 hours of tossing and turning to get to the point which is that this is a potentially disastrous situation for me. I don't know why Father Lufer failed to show up tonight, but I'm damn glad he didn't, because there couldn't possibly be a worse place for me to confront him. If he wanted to, he could lock me up here and throw away the key. I've got to get out of here right now and hope to intercept him on more favorable ground. Luckily, if there's a wing of this place that's high security, this isn't it. I think I could make my way out with nothing but the essentials: recorder, notebooks, tapes, and passport. But a 100-mile trip with nothing but line in my pockets is not an appealing prospect. I should at least make a try at persuading Tim to liberate just one credit card from my billfold in the safe. Monday, June 3rd. The fugitive at 35,000 feet. So that's that. Between now and Hamburg, I've got a lovely bunch of hours ahead of me in which to sleep and bring this journal up to date. And in a nice, roomy, first-class seat, since no other was available on this flight. The Laurentians won't notice the difference, and surely they must expect to send off their apostates with a little visa golden handshake. Though it took the better part of 2 hours, Tim was persuadable. I may be dumb, but nobody ever said I didn't know how to make myself understood. I made a stab at getting him to throw in the keys to his car, but no, he wouldn't go that far. It took a couple more hours, but I did finally manage to hitch a ride. Priests have to cultivate an innocent, harmless look, which comes in handy on the road, as every serial killer knows. Once I got to an automatic teller machine, I was home free. I reached Father Lufer's office at 11 o'clock in the morning, and by God, there he was, just where I'd left him almost a month ago, something I hadn't exactly counted on, since it was Sunday. He looked up at me from behind his desk, plainly astounded, and said, "You didn't have to do this, Jared. I was planning to come see you today." He actually didn't get it. He thought I jumped the wall out of mere impatience to be near him. "I'm here for a reckoning, Father Lufer." He capped his pen and set it aside. Nice. Well thought out moves. "A reckoning, eh? You sound like the staunch hero of some turn-of-the-century melodrama." "Different century," I said, sitting down, "but that's the idea." "What is it you want reckoned?" "I'll tell you what I remember, then you can tell me the rest." "All right." They said I might or might not eventually remember the explosion, but all I remember right now is a little flash. For a while I thought it was something I dreamed, and maybe it is, but I don't think so. "Do you know the setup in the theater?" "Yes." "Your man in Radenow laid it out for you." Father Lufer nodded, then added, "Our man in Europe, actually." "This is the elderly person who introduced himself to me as Herr Reichman." "That's right." "Why didn't you tell me you already had a man on the ground there?" He shrugged. "It's always better if you think it's all up to you." "Then why did he phone me with instructions?" "He got impatient. Professionals always get impatient with amateurs. You know that." I shook my head. "Why did you send me at all?" "We sent you for exactly the reasons I gave you." He smiled briefly. "For almost exactly the reasons I gave you. Under his real name, Reichman maintains perfectly respectable offices in Berlin, Prague, and Paris, and works on retainer for a dozen different firms and individuals, mostly in the US. He's a very useful, knowledgeable person, and 99% of the chores we give him are routine and innocuous. But when we asked him to look into Charles Adderley for us, he showed a side we hadn't seen before. His approach was, I can't make out what the blighter is saying, so why don't I just shoot him and be done with it? Whatever you may think of us after this dreadful experience, Jared, absolutely no one considered taking such advice. We had to send someone of our own to have a look at Adderley, and believe me, we very much wanted you to persuade us that he was harmless. And I failed to do that. It was out of your hands, really. He was condemned from his own mouth by the speeches you faxed to us. And you actually authorized his assassination. The man shrugged. You said it very well, Jared. These days are still those days. Nothing's changed in the last 500 years, or the last 1,000, except that heretics can no longer be executed in public. I take all this as seriously as Pope Innocent III, who ordered up a crusade against the Albigenses. I take it all as seriously as Pius V, who, when he was the Grand Inquisitor, personally instigated the massacre of thousands of Protestants in southern Italy. I take it all as seriously as Thomas Aquinas, who said, if ordinary criminals may be justly put to death, then how much more may heretics be justly slain? For Thomas well knew that the murderer just shortens his neighbor's temporal life, whereas the heretic deprives them of eternal life. If you no longer understand the difference, or if it no longer matters to you, then I assume you've lost your faith. You assume rightly, Father. I'm afraid it's fallen to the modernist fallacy. I'm sorry to hear it, he said, and I could see that he sincerely meant it. Since you quoted me about these days still being those days, I assume the resourceful Herr Reichman had the theater bugged. Of course he did. It was an obvious thing to do. Adderley and his followers were just too incredibly trusting to survive for very long as subversives. Yes, they were. So you knew they were recruiting me. Yes, that was an unexpected bonus, and you handled it just right. Except that I ended up recruited. Yes, except for that. He frowned for a moment, then looked up. You say you now remember the explosion. I said I remember a little flash. I'm looking up out of a well at Herr Reichman, who's looking down into the well at me. I think this was the stairwell at the theater. That's right. That's all you remember? I nodded. I'm not exactly sure what happened there. Reichman's story is that you blundered into him on the stairs moments before the bomb was to go off. Evidently you assumed he was up to no good and wouldn't let him talk you into leaving the theater with him, and when you headed down the stairs to warn the others, he slugged you and left you to your fate. This was relatively lucky for you, since that iron staircase was the only structure that survived both the blast and the collapse of the roof. You don't think it actually happened that way. It may have happened that way. All I know for certain is that this is what Reichman wants us to believe, and we're in no position to contradict him. There was nothing for it now but to ask the question I dreaded to ask. Did Reichman tell you who was in the theater when it was destroyed? He indicated that he got everyone. I stared at him bleakly. His exact words were, "The inner circle is gone." I said, "Everyone else seems to think the theater was empty." Father Lufer shrugged. Well, he missed one. Me. He shook his head. Jared, you know I think highly of you, but you're not a charismatic firebrand. I don't think being a firebrand has anything to do with it. Again, he shrugged. You know, I couldn't figure out why B insisted on putting his entire schedule on hold while he dealt with me. It made even less sense after Charles' death. Do you know what I'm talking about? No, frankly, I don't. What is it that made less sense after Charles' death? Why B insisted on spending so much time with me? Father Lufer started to tell me that he didn't know what in the world I was talking about. Then the light dawned. You're talking about the woman. Sharon. Sheeran, I told him. Sheeran is B. I thought Charles was B. Charles was B, but so was Sheeran. He shook his massive head, shooing away a bothersome fly. B had to spend time with me so that even if worse came to worse, you could be told that you failed. You're being far too elliptical for this old brain, Jared. If worse came to worse. If you succeeded in killing both Charles and Sheeran. If I succeeded in killing both Charles and Sheeran, then I still will have failed? That's right, because you didn't kill me. I'm not a charismatic firebrand, but that doesn't matter. I am B. You are B. You really believe that? It's not a matter of belief, Father. I'm no longer what I was when I sat here 3.5 weeks ago, and you can't change me back to what I was. Father Lufer leaned forward, interested at last. And you really think this matters, Jared? You think you'll do something different now that you're B? Oh yes, I told him, getting to my feet. There's no question about that. That's a certainty. I'm not sure whether to scoff or to shudder, Jared, but if I had a gun in my desk, I'd take it out and shoot you dead just to be on the safe side. Would you really? Yes, I would. Do you remember your friend Sheeran's last speech at the theater ago, or did you lose that along with the explosion? I lost it, but I listened to a tape of it yesterday. I didn't know that, he said heavily. At any rate, Reichman made a tape of it as well, and he played it for me on the phone. That was what? He spread his hands wide in a gesture of helplessness. That was what sealed her fate, I suggested. Yes, that's right. You see, she showed me more clearly than any advocate of ecumenism why we are a confraternity, Jared. We Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus. We've drawn ourselves up from the slime in which animism grovels so proudly. We represent what is highest, what is most upward-reaching, transcendental, and sublime in mankind. What stands between the members of the confraternity are minor rifts. What stands between the confraternity and animism is a gulf as wide as the gulf between man and brute, spirit and matter. I agree. What will you do now? I took the tape recorder out of my pocket and showed him that it was running. First, I'll find a safe place for this tape, Father. You called us too incredibly trusting to be conspirators, but you're pretty trusting yourself. You're quite right, Jared. None of us has been trained to look at the world with suspicious eyes. But you won't turn it over to the police. Certainly not. This is my safe conduct for at least as long as you're alive. Once the police have it, it's worthless for that purpose. He nodded. Yes, you'll definitely want to find a very safe place for that. I left, and because it seemed like a good time to start being a little less incredibly trusting, I didn't turn my back on him till I was outside with the door shut between us. Tuesday, June 4th. Radnow Revisited. I'm installed in my old room at the hotel, and it feels rather eerie. The desk clerk acknowledged my appearance without surprise, allowing himself the liberty of hoping I was now completely restored after my unpleasant experience of nearly being blown to bits. I arrived early enough to do a little useful groundwork. I picked up a few necessities like underwear and shaving equipment and spent some time with telephone directories at the library. I managed to place a display ad in the local paper asking Sheeran or Michael to contact me. Naturally, the ad takers would accept nothing but real money, so tomorrow I'll have to see if this piece of magic plastic will actually produce more cash if it inserted in the proper slot of some proper machine. My work with the phone books paid off to the extent that I managed to locate Frau Dr. Hartmann. She says my head should be cut off and thrown to the dogs, and torture wouldn't induce her to help me find either Michael or Sheeran, if they were alive, although beyond prosecution I am, in her opinion, guilty of their murder. On this basis, I guess I can cross Frau Hartmann right off my list of supporters. I talked to half a dozen people with first names approximately Michael and last names approximately Dershinsky, and have dozens more to try as far as north as Hamburg and as far north as Hanover. Or as far south as Hanover. And if I want to try as far east as Berlin, I should be able to keep busy through Columbus Day. It's now 8 p.m. and I'm running on 3 cylinders. All I can do at this point is stay awake long enough to reset my biological clock to local time. In truth, I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing here. I suppose I'm here to prove that Herr Reichman and Heinz Tiedel are wrong. The inner circle is not gone. But I don't know how to go about it. I can't seriously expect city officials to dig up 1,000,000 tons of rubble to prove something they already believe to be true. What then? The Tiedels aren't going to be any more helpful in person than they were over the phone. Can I imagine myself persuading the guardians at Sheeran's clinic that I'm a close friend who should be given her address and phone number, even though I don't know her last name? No, frankly, I can't. Of course, I can just plant myself on the front steps of the place and see if she shows up someday. For the moment, I can't think of anything else useful to do. For the moment, I'm too jet-lagged to think at all. Wednesday, June 5th. Plastic death. This morning I found myself a money machine, shoved in my plastic, and learned that I'd ceased to exist. My card had been revoked and was fresh out of magic. I considered myself lucky. They could have been a day quicker, in which case the card wouldn't have passed muster at the hotel. I had a couple of choices. I could cash in my return plane ticket, or I could call home and ask my mother for a loan. I decided to cash in the plane ticket. I then had to think about my position with the hotel. As long as I didn't try to use the card again there, I figured I was okay, and the hotel would not get stiffed since the card was still valid when I checked in. Presumably the Laurentians would get stuck with the bill, which did not tax my delicate conscience at all. Since the airline has no office in Radnau, I'd have to make a trip to Hamburg, which I decided to get out of the way. I made it back by 6 o'clock, having looked forward to dinner, missed lunch. As I was heading up to my room to rinse off, the clerk called me over to inform me that my card hadn't passed muster after all. I not only owed them for 1 day, I owed them for 2. Having missed today's checkout deadline by several hours, and of course I was going to be a cash customer from now on if I wanted to stay past tomorrow morning, I shoved nearly half my resources across the counter and told him I'd think it over. Yeah. Saturday, June 8th. Walkabout. So at 11 Thursday morning, I joined the ranks of the homeless, my worldly goods in a plastic bag. I stopped at a cafe for a croissant and coffee while I wondered what to do with myself. I thought later I'd look for a cheap pension or maybe just a pleasant bench in the park. I went to the site of the theater. It was uncannily tidy, smartly fenced off to a height well over 2 meters. The buildings around it were perfectly unscathed. A demolition contractor could have demanded a bonus for a job done this neatly. The top of the iron spiral staircase was sticking out of the rubble like the mast of a sinking schooner. The total experience wasn't inspirational or educational or anything. I stood there looking through the fence for about 5 minutes, then left. I paid a visit to Gustelmeyer's shop of exotic leftovers. He was polite, even sympathetic, but had no suggestions. I spent the afternoon at the library finding new ways to spell Michael and Dershinsky. I decided to take my list of numbers to Gustelmeyer's shop on the morrow to see if he'd let me use his phone. I returned to the hotel to see if anyone had responded to my advertisement. No one had. I lingered over a pizza and a beer till it was quite dark. Then I started walking. This time I didn't know where I was going except in a general way. I have a pretty good sense of direction, but if I didn't find out what I was looking for the first time out, so what? Time was one commodity I had plenty of. I walked and walked, on feet already sore, and the sights and smells began to come back to me. As the social and economic atmosphere went down the scale, my spirits went up. I was heading into Radnau's grimiest neighborhood, the domain of factories, machine shops, brickyards, and warehouses, inhabited at this hour only by night watchmen and guard dogs. Before long I spotted a small nondescript building just ahead, a sort of shed between a warehouse and a railroad yard, and I headed for it, hoping the door would open, and it did, giving me a double lungful of cigarette smoke, booze, and La Vie en Rose. It was Little Bohemia, and by God, it felt like home. I breached. I made my way to the table at the back, all the way to the back, against a wall solid with framed drawings and prints. Not one of them straight, not one of them with a piece of glass that had been cleaned in 20 years. At eye level when I sat down was a faded sketch of Igor Stravinsky that appeared to be signed by Picasso. Elsewhere it looked like nobody had moved since Charles and I had left 3 weeks before. When the waitress came over to see what I wanted, I asked her if her name was really Theda. "It really is," she said with a smile. "Are you drinking Lagavulin tonight?" "I'm drinking your cheapest rock gut, please, Theda," I told her politely, but when it came a couple minutes later, it tasted just like Lagavulin to me. Someone spoke at my elbow, and I looked up into a distantly familiar face. It was Albrecht. He of the giant intellect, the smirking 20-year-old Englishman who volunteered to dump me in a lake the first time I visited the sub-basement at the theater. I said, "What?" He said, sneering, "Are you B now?" I thought about this some. I've never had much opportunity to learn how to deal with hostile people. Some priests do and some priests don't, but I feel like I must know the ABCs of it. I said to him, "Why don't you sit down and tell me what's on your mind?" "Is the question too difficult for you?" "Yes, it is," I told him. With a triumph already in hand, he took a seat across from me. I said, "Why do you ask me this question?" "You were being groomed, weren't you? Isn't that the word? Groomed?" "Well, there is certainly such a word, but no one ever told me I was being groomed." He shrugged contemptuously. "I've abandoned the priesthood," I told him. This got a blink. When I spoke with the man who originally sent me here, Father Lufra, I told him that killing B had been a wasted effort because B is still here in the person of me. But I certainly don't think I'm ready to begin where Sheeran left off. And by the way, I've deposited a tape of that conversation with a friend, otherwise I'd be a hunted man, possibly even a dead man by now. This got 3 blinks in rapid succession. I asked him if this answered his question, probably a mistake since it seemed to put him back on track. "Anyone can be hunted," he said. "The question is, can you do what B did?" "What exactly do you have in mind?" You took in their insights, but do you have any of your own? Are you a thinker and a teacher, or just a reciter of holy wit? If all you do is chant the scriptures, then you're no more B than I am. You're just an altar boy who has all the responses down pat. I downed some rotgut and wished this young whippersnapper was far, far away. Finally, I said to him, "I'll breach the past 10 days have been a bit hectic for me, so it's absolutely true that I haven't added a single word to the teachings of B. Whether I can or not is another matter. Be that as it may, you're absolutely right. If all I can do is chant the Holy Writ as I heard it from Charles and Sheeran, then I'm no more than an altar boy." A breach smirked. "But you don't really think you are, do you?" "I don't really think I am, no, but I haven't had a chance to prove myself one way or the other." "Do you want a chance to prove yourself?" What could I say to that? No.